Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We all want to learn new things quickly and thoroughly, right? I mean, who has time to wade through endless information and still feel lost? That's why we're here, to help you grasp those key concepts without wrestling a textbook. And today we're diving into something super cool, generative learning strategies. They're like, I don't know, the secret sauce to truly owning what you learn.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with it, producing something meaningful, going beyond just the surface level, really making the information your own.
And we've got an amazing guide for this deep dive, a review article by Garvin Broad. It's called Generative Learning, Which Strategies for What Age? And it was published in Educational Psychology Review back in December 2021. This article takes a deep dive into 6 really popular generative learning strategies, and what's super interesting is that it compares how well they work for learners of different ages.
What's really valuable about this review is it highlights a crucial point. These active learning strategies, they tend to be really effective for university students,
Yeah.
right? But the picture gets way more complex when we look at younger learners.
That makes sense. Kids' brains are still developing, right? So our mission today is to unpack these differences, like which strategies work best at different stages of learning, all based on Broad's analysis.
Right. We want to equip you with the knowledge to choose the most effective strategies for yourself or for the learners you're supporting.
All right, let's kick things off with concept mapping. So when you hear that term, what pops into your head?
Well, imagine you have this big topic, right? And you break it down visually into its core ideas and how they all connect. That's basically concept mapping. You're creating a diagram, kind of like a map, showing the hierarchy of concepts and their relationships. It stems from this idea called Ausubel's assimilation theory. Basically, we learn new things by linking them to what we already know, kind of like adding a new branch to an existing tree of knowledge. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, totally. And the review emphasizes that it's much more effective when you create these maps yourself rather than just, studying one that's already made. Why is that?
So when you build the map yourself, you're actively making those connections. You're thinking about the hierarchy, putting in the mental effort. And this has been shown in tons of studies. Meta-analyses, these big research roundups have confirmed this. For instance, Schroeder and colleagues in 2018, they did this huge meta-analysis and found that student-generated concept mapping, it has a much stronger positive effect on learning compared to just looking at a pre-made one. And this was consistent across different ages, from like 4th to 8th graders all the way up to college students. The average learning boost was pretty significant too, around 0.72 standard deviations. So for you listeners, if you're grappling with a complex topic, actively drawing those connections isn't just a fun activity, it's actually backed by solid research, especially if you're past elementary school.
Okay, that's super interesting. But what about younger kids? I feel like I've heard that concept mapping might not be so effective for them. Is that true?
Yeah, you're on the right track there. Novak, a big name in concept mapping, he suggested that it really starts to shine around 4th grade. And practically speaking, concept mapping often involves a lot of writing, labeling those concepts and connections. And that can be really tough for very young children who are still, mastering their writing skills. Even Bra's review states that there's just not enough strong evidence to say it works for kids below 4th grade.
So it sounds like the level of support someone needs with concept mapping might change depending on how old they are.
Exactly. Gurlitt and Rankel, they did this study in 2008 that really illustrates this. They found that university students actually learned better from concept maps that were less structured, kind of like a more open-ended prompt. They called them low coherence maps. This forced them to really think about how everything fits together. But high school students, they preferred and learned better from maps that were more structured, the high coherence ones. It's like they needed more guidance, the main categories laid out for them.
That makes total sense. Like, you can't just give a first grader a blank sheet and say, okay, go map out the solar system.
Right. And a study by Karpik and his colleagues in 2014 with older elementary school children supports this need for support. They found that having kids complete partially filled in concept maps was way more effective than having them create the whole thing from scratch. And of course, better than no concept maps at all. So scaffolding, providing some structure for younger learners, that seems to be key.
So the bottom line for our listeners, when it comes to concept mapping and different age groups, what should they keep in mind?
Well, the research strongly suggests that concept mapping can be a really awesome learning tool from 4th grade onwards. But if you're working with younger kids, they'll probably need a lot of support and structure to make it work for them. It's not something they can just magically pick up and run with.
Got it. All right, let's move on to the next strategy, generating explanations. So how does this one help us learn?
Generating explanations is all about, well, asking learners to explain things, to put their understanding into words. It forces them to activate their prior knowledge, connect it to the new stuff, elaborate on the details, think about similarities and differences, maybe even make some inferences. It's all about reasoning through the material. Think of techniques like elaborative interrogation, where you constantly ask why and explain those reasons, or self-explanation, where you're basically explaining the material to yourself, almost like you're teaching it.
That sounds pretty cognitively demanding. Does it actually work well across different ages?
You're right, it does require some mental horsepower. Bisra and colleagues, they did a big meta-analysis in 2018 on self-explanation, and they found a moderate positive effect on learning overall. However, the effect was a bit smaller for elementary and high school students compared to university students. That's something to keep in mind. And it's important to note that many of these studies didn't always account for how much time people spent on the task, which could have affected the results. Another meta-analysis, this one focused on math instruction by Riddle Johnson and colleagues in 2017, showed kind of mixed results for lasting improvements in conceptual understanding in elementary students. So if you're working with younger learners, just asking them to explain might not cut it. You might need to scaffold it, break it down with some targeted questions or examples.
So it sounds like explanations for younger learners, the jury's still out a bit.
In a way, yes. There was research by Dentner and Tupin back in 1986. They found that the ability to consistently make those deeper inferences based on the structure of information, it doesn't really become strong until around 9 years old, and that could definitely impact the quality of explanations younger kids can generate. However, there are some interesting lab studies with preschoolers, like those by Ligari and Lombroso. In 2014, they show that even preschoolers can benefit from explaining in certain contexts. So maybe the specific way the explanation is prompted makes a difference.
Fascinating. Maybe the lab setting can kind of isolate those benefits more easily than a real-world classroom.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
Riddle Johnson had this study in 2006 with 3rd to 5th graders, and he found that self-explanation led to similar learning gains as direct instruction. But another study by Misseldun and his team in 2013 with 2nd to 4th graders showed that while self-explanation was better than just passively reviewing the material, it wasn't necessarily better than solving practice problems for the same amount of time. And think about it, even doing practice problems involves some level of active generation of answers.
What about elaborative interrogation? The whole why questioning thing. Does that follow a similar pattern?
Yeah, there was a study by Wood and colleagues in 1990 with 4th to 8th graders, and they did see benefits when students actively answered why questions. But Presley and others, they reviewed a bunch of studies in the early 90s, including those with younger children, and they concluded that the benefits of this why questioning seem to increase as kids get older. Maybe because accessing and using prior knowledge gets easier with age.
Okay, so the key takeaway here is that generating explanations seems to get more effective as learners mature, probably because their reasoning and knowledge base are growing. But for elementary students, the effectiveness is still a bit unclear, right? It seems to depend a lot on the type of explanation and how much support they get.
Exactly. There are a lot of factors at play.
All right, let's move on to generating predictions. This one sounds like a really fun way to get the learning gears turning. So how does it work?
With generating predictions, you're essentially asking learners to guess, to hypothesize about an outcome or an answer before they actually encounter the information. It forces them to activate their prior knowledge, try to connect it to the new topic. There's also the added bonus of sparking curiosity, maybe even some surprise if their prediction is wrong, which can make the learning stick. And of course, after making a prediction, they get feedback. And processing that feedback is a crucial part of learning, tapping into those executive function skills.
So has this been proven effective across different ages?
Interestingly, yeah, generating predictions seems to work pretty well in classroom studies across various subjects and ages. We're talking about studies in reading, physics, biology, with students from elementary all the way to high school. It's even a core part of those audience response systems in university lectures. But Broad's review mentions that since prediction is often used with other learning activities, it's hard to isolate its specific effect. And surprisingly, there aren't many meta-analyses specifically focusing on prediction.
But there are individual studies that have investigated it, right?
Absolutely. For example, Inagaki and Hatano, they had this study way back in 1977. They found that 4th graders learned about conservation and physics better when they made predictions beforehand. Similar positive effects have been found with 3rd and 7th graders understanding texts, and even more recent work with 3rd to 5th graders on changing their beliefs and 2nd graders learning new facts shows that making a prediction before seeing the answer can boost memory. So compared to just passively receiving information, making a prediction seems beneficial across different ages.
And what about differences in how well it works for different age groups? Have we seen anything there?
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff. Metcalf and Cornell, they had this study in 2007 comparing 6th graders and college students learning definitions. They found that making predictions, even wrong ones, helped both groups learn better than just being given the definitions. In a more recent study by Brightweiser and Broad in 2020, they found that for 4th and 5th graders, prediction was actually more helpful than generating examples, whereas for university students, the two strategies were similarly effective. So prediction might be a particularly useful tool for younger learners. Kind of a surprising twist that what works best for younger kids isn't always the same as for adults. Wow, that's pretty counterintuitive. Right. And there's a study by Carnero and colleagues in 2018. They looked at preschoolers up to 3rd graders guessing words in pairs, which is kind of a form of prediction. They found that the benefit of guessing over just studying increased with age. They think it's because older kids get better at using the feedback and ignoring incorrect guesses. So prediction itself is helpful early on, but the ability to really learn from the feedback might improve with age.
So it sounds like generating predictions is a pretty valuable tool across ages, even in early elementary. And while the ability to learn from feedback gets better, the act of prediction itself is beneficial.
That's right. It seems like a pretty versatile strategy.
All right, let's dive into generating questions. This one seems like it requires a good deal of self-awareness, like knowing what you don't know.
You hit the nail on the head. Generating good questions means you need to access your existing knowledge, pinpoint those gaps, recognize what you don't know. It can be implemented in different ways, but Broad's review focuses on self-questioning, where learners generate questions for themselves as they learn. It helps them focus on the important parts, monitor their understanding. As you can imagine, this relies heavily on those metacognitive abilities, that self-awareness about your own learning.
And how effective is self-questioning across different ages? I imagine younger kids might struggle with this one.
You know, it's interesting. Wong, back in 1985, he did a review that suggested self-questioning can be helpful, but only if students are taught how to do it properly and given enough time to practice. But Rosenshine and colleagues, they did this meta-analysis in 1996. They looked at studies where students were trained to generate questions while or after reading. They found an overall positive effect, particularly on non-standardized tests, but the results for younger students were pretty mixed. Only 1 out of 4 studies with 3rd graders showed a clear benefit, and the findings for 4th to 9th graders were also all over the place. And there's another large study by Souvenir and Cronenberger in 2007. They found no real benefit of question training for 3rd graders in science and math. So for you listeners, if you're thinking about using this with younger learners, the evidence is a bit shaky.
So it's not as universally positive as some of the other strategies, at least for younger kids.
It seems that way. For older children, the mixed evidence suggests that it might be more effective if teachers provide lots of support. For example, King, he had this study in 1994 with 4th and 5th graders. He found that giving them generic question starters, like sentence stems, led to some learning benefits, but just asking them to come up with questions on their own didn't really do much. And even then, you could argue that providing SEMs isn't true question generation. But King did find in a 1991 study that training 9th graders to ask themselves questions during lectures did improve their comprehension and memory. So maybe the ability to formulate your own relevant questions develops a bit later.
So it sounds like, similar to concept mapping, the level of support matters a lot, especially for younger learners.
Absolutely. And there's a study by Denner and Rickards in 1987. They compared 5th, 8th, and 11th graders directly. They found that across all ages, students who generated their own questions actually learned less than those who were given questions or who just reread the material. But they did notice that older students tended to ask more conceptual questions, which they linked to their more developed metacognitive skills. Younger kids tended to ask simpler, more factual questions, often about less important details.
So the takeaway here is that while generating questions can be great for university students and maybe older high schoolers, it's probably not very effective for younger elementary students without a lot of instruction and support. And even for those in between, the effectiveness is a bit iffy and seems to really depend on how much guidance they get.
Yeah, that's not a simple answer.
All right, let's move on to a strategy that's got a lot of buzz around it and a good bit of research backing it up. generating answers, or what's often called practice testing. So how does this one work? It's magic.
The basic idea is that when you actively try to retrieve information, like answering questions or recalling facts, it triggers this memory search process in your brain, strengthening those connections to related knowledge. It creates a more elaborate, more robust memory trace. Even if you don't get the answer right, the effort helps organize your knowledge and highlights those shaky areas. And like predictions, getting feedback, knowing what you got right or wrong, makes practice testing even more powerful.
And the research seems pretty unanimous on the benefits of this, right?
Oh yeah, totally. Over the last 2 decades, countless studies have shown what's known as the testing effect, the huge positive impact of practice testing. Major meta-analyses like those by Rawson and Dunlosky in 2012, Roediger and Butler in 2011, they all consistently show strong benefits. Rowland's meta-analysis in 2014 found a moderate to large positive effect compared to just rereading, and Adesop and Trevisan's work in 2017 showed similar benefits whether the testing was in a classroom or a lab, and for both verbal and nonverbal material. It's a real robust finding.
Wow, that's impressive. So, does this effectiveness hold up across different ages? Because, sometimes things that work for adults don't translate so well to kids.
What's really encouraging about practice testing is that Adesop and Trevisan's meta-analysis actually found very little difference in how well it worked across elementary, secondary, and post-secondary students. So it seems like a strategy that can benefit learners at pretty much any level. And it doesn't seem to matter much how much prior knowledge the learner has. Lepowski and colleagues in 2014, they did a study with first and third graders and found clear benefits of testing over restudying. They even saw a trend, though not statistically significant, toward a bigger effect in the third graders.
So, practice testing is kind of a universal win.
For the most part, yes. But there's a study by Aslan and Boyle in 2016. They look at the forward testing effect, where being tested on earlier material can actually boost your learning of new related information. They found this effect in college students and older elementary kids, but not in younger ones. They think this might be because younger kids sometimes have more trouble dealing with interference from previously studied stuff, and this is linked to the development of those executive functions we mentioned earlier. So the basic benefits are there across ages, but some of the more complex effects might develop later.
But the bottom line is that actively trying to retrieve information, practicing retrieval through testing, is a really powerful tool for everyone, no matter the age.
Exactly. It's a super solid strategy.
All right, finally, let's talk about generating drawings.
Yeah.
How does turning words into pictures help us understand and remember what we read?
When you generate drawings while learning from text, you're basically transforming verbal information into a visual representation, often focusing on spatial relationships. It's different from concept mapping, where the visual elements don't necessarily resemble the concepts. Think of drawing a bicycle versus a concept map about transportation.
So what's the thinking behind why creating these drawings helps with learning?
It's largely based on Mayer's generative theory of learning. Basically, to create a drawing that represents the text, you have to select the important information, organize it into a mental summary, then build a visual representation. It involves using your prior knowledge, analogical reasoning to make sure your drawing reflects the text structure, and integrating information from both the verbal and visual parts of your mind, all while monitoring your drawing's accuracy. It's a really active process.
That does sound like a lot of cognitive work. So how effective is it across different ages?
The findings on generating drawings are a bit mixed. Some reviews and meta-analyses show positive effects, especially compared to just reading. For instance, Fiorella and Zane's review in 2018, they found that drawing was better for both comprehension and transfer compared to just reading. But they also highlighted that drawing was only more beneficial than just seeing illustrations when there was a good amount of instructional support. Van Meter in 2001, he found that the most effective approach was actually when learners compared their own drawing to a provided illustration. So just telling someone to draw might not be enough. The drawing's accuracy and the learner's ability to monitor their understanding seem crucial.
What about age-related patterns? Does it work better for certain age groups?
It's interesting, the reviews by Van Meter and Garner and Fiorella and Zhang, they didn't find a clear age-related pattern across all studies. But when you look at individual studies, some trends do emerge. Lesgold and colleagues in 1975, they did a study with first graders and saw some benefit of creating visual representations compared to just seeing drawings, but they used cutouts, which is a bit different from freehand drawing. And with slightly older kids, 4th and 5th graders, Rasko and colleagues in 1975 found that they benefited less from drawing than from being given illustrations when there wasn't much guidance.
So it sounds like younger learners might need more help with this one.
Definitely. Studies with older children, like Schmeck and colleagues in 2014, they worked with 8th graders who were given basic outlines to start their drawings, and they saw more positive results. Van Meter and colleagues in 2006, they compared 4th and 6th graders and found that only the 6th graders really benefited from drawing, and that benefit was even stronger when they were asked to compare their drawing to a provided one. The 4th graders didn't seem to benefit even with that extra support. And there's a study by Van Esten and Hamaker in 1990. They found no real benefit of drawing for 1st and 2nd graders trying to solve math problems, even with practice and support, while 5th graders did show some benefit, though the study lacked a strong control group.
So the bottom line is that drawing as a way to learn from text seems less effective for elementary school students unless they're given a lot of support. It seems like its effectiveness might gradually increase as they develop better visual spatial reasoning and self-monitoring skills, maybe peaking in early adulthood.
Yeah, that's a pretty reasonable conclusion based on the current research.
Okay, so when we look at all 6 strategies, it seems like while they all have potential, how well they work can really differ depending on the age of the learner, especially for elementary school children.
Exactly. Broad's review really makes this clear. All 6 strategies have generally been shown to work for university students. But when we focus on younger learners, it's a much more mixed bag. Practice testing and generating predictions seem beneficial even in early elementary, while generating drawings and self-questioning appear ineffective until secondary school. Concept mapping and generating explanations fall somewhere in between, with their effectiveness for younger kids being inconsistent and often depending on the support provided. So for you listeners out there, if you're involved in teaching or learning at different levels, it's super important to remember that not all learning strategies are created equal when it comes to age.
Right. And it's important to remember that our current understanding is based on the research that's been done so far. There might be limitations in terms of the number of studies for some age groups, and like all research, there's always the potential for publication bias, where certain findings are more likely to get published.
Absolutely. And Broad points out that those self-regulatory and inhibitory abilities, which are crucial for using these strategies effectively, they continue to develop throughout childhood and adolescence. So that development likely plays a big role in these age-related differences we see.
It really highlights that when it comes to learning, one size definitely doesn't fit all.
It really doesn't. The way we learn and the strategies that work best for us, they evolve as we gain knowledge and as our cognitive and metacognitive abilities mature. And the fact that different strategies have different patterns of effectiveness across ages probably reflects the specific mental skills and self-awareness they require. Like a strategy that demands complex reasoning or lots of self-monitoring might not be as effective for a younger learner whose brain is still developing those capabilities.
So for our listeners, the main takeaway here is that the effectiveness of active learning strategies isn't universal, especially across ages. It's so important to think about what each strategy demands of the learner and where they are in their developmental journey.
And it's worth considering how you might adapt your approach. For younger learners, providing more support, like partially completed concept maps, sentence starters for explanations, question stems, or prompts to compare their drawings to examples, could really unlock the benefits of these strategies.
And of course, the research in this area is ongoing. We definitely need more studies comparing strategies across a broader range of ages and investigating the cognitive processes that make them work or not work at different stages.
For sure. A better understanding of those mechanisms will give us even more insights into how to best utilize these powerful learning tools.
So we'll leave you with this. How might these findings change how you approach your own learning or how you help others learn, whether they're children or adults? What adjustments could you make based on their learning goals and developmental level? It's a really fascinating area, and we encourage you to explore these strategies further. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. It was great to chat with you and all our listeners.
Until next time, keep diving deep.